right. Good evening. It is a little bit past 6. It's 6:20, so we'll call to order the Bristol, Virginia City Council for January 28th, 2020. Please join me in a moment of silence. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, good evening, everybody, and thank you for bearing with us. We were upstairs in another meeting, so thank you all for waiting around and being patient with us. Going to move into Mayor's Minute and Council comments. Do we have any comments from members?
Just say, had the opportunity, the fire chief invited us Saturday to attend the wet down ceremony for Engine 2, and it's an interesting ceremony that goes through, but I'll just say it's a very nice apparatus that they have, and you know, they went through a lot of painstaking work to make sure they got a good value on that, and also to get a piece of equipment that will serve the citizens of this city very well. So I appreciate their work in finally getting that piece of equipment, and hope that it's not used very much, if at all.
So I got a couple things I'll say. On January the 20th, Vice Mayor Hartley and I, along with Mayor Fire-Robin from Bristol, Tennessee, participated with about 300 people in the Martin Luther King Day March and celebration at the train station. And it was a really good turnout, and I appreciate everyone who was able to make it out for that. It's important to be able to remember where we've been and know where we're going. So thank you to everyone who attended that. And the city manager and myself actually went Sunday night to Lee Street Baptist Church to celebrate Pastor Reed, who I know was here a minute ago, and I think he ducked out. I'm going to say it anyway. He'll hear. So he got an honorary doctorate degree, and we went and we celebrated there at Lee Street with Dr. Johnson hosting us. And it was a really good turnout, and we appreciate everything that he does for his community and for our city. And it was a really nice event. City Manager?
No comments.
All right, matters to be presented by members of the public, non-agenda items. We have two people who are signed up. First person is Mr. Pollard.
Good evening, gentlemen of the City Council. My name is Michael Pollard. I live at 101 Ashley Drive. Two things to bring up this evening. One is a question which I know you may or may not be able to answer. A lot of people have asked me, and I gave an answer based on my understanding, but things may have changed. Some people have asked me concerning the construction on Island Road at Lee Highway, and my understanding from previous plats was that an extra turning lane was being added to Island Road and to Lee Highway, that intersection. I've heard a suggestion that there may also be a park and ride added there, and the current layout looks like that might be appropriate, but I wanted to find out for sure what was going on rather than making assumptions.
That is a park and ride.
It is a park and ride?
Yes.
Okay. I know that some of the suggestions were to have one on the other side of the exit, but I didn't know about there. Thank you.
VDOT requires, with projects now, there's a requirement of park and rides. So when you do an interstate interchange, they want you to do a park and ride. And exit 14, in Abingdon, they did a park and ride up there as well when they changed that interchange.
Okay. I will pass that along to the people who asked me. I prefer to deal from a position of facts rather than a position of supposition. So I appreciate that. The other thing is a topic of consideration. Recently in the paper, and I was in person present for some of the discussions, some in Bristol, Tennessee have suggested that Bristol, Virginia may not be pulling its own weight concerning some of our local nonprofits. While on the one hand, I want to strongly encourage the city to not spend anything that it can't afford, and sometimes nonprofits need to do a little bit of their own pulling their own weight. I might also point out that the city might be in a better place to fund some of those nonprofits had we not recently decided to subsidize a Pizza Hut moving a couple of blocks from where it used to be after they had already started construction, and they didn't seem to need the additional support, that they seemed to be perfectly able to fund those projects on their own. And $700-something thousand going towards our nonprofits might have been extremely beneficial for them. Thank you very much.
All righty, thank you. Let's see, so moving to the regular agenda items. Item 1 is a public hearing regarding the fiscal year 2020-2021 CD. Oh, you signed, did you sign it? You did, I'm sorry. Come on up.
You said there were 2 people.
There were, I didn't listen to myself. I'll see myself out.
Gentlemen, my name is Nancy Marney. I'm a resident of the city of Bristol, Virginia. I am a property owner. I pay my tax. I have a question here. I don't know that you know the answer to this, but I'm going to get it one way or another. If there is a conflict between the IDA and the city council, who can overrule who? In other words, the city council appoints the members of the IDA. Now, from having been upstairs, I've learned a few things. If the IDA decides it does not want to spend its money, and I still don't quite understand that, if they decide that they do not want to make their money available for a project, can the council say, yes, you will? I don't know. Or can the IDA just say it's our money and it's our business and you just mind your own? I don't think that's correct. But what I don't know is, can the IDA override the council a council decision, and can the council override an IDA decision? That, I think, is mainly what my question is. I don't know the answer. If you all do, I'd like to hear it.
I might defer to the city manager / city attorney on this.
I think it just depends on the project as to how a conflict would be resolved. But first, let's talk about the comment IDA money. The IDA does not have any money. Not because of the falls. Even if the falls was not a part of this picture, the IDA does not have money. The money all belongs to the city. So if the IDA is going to do a project and a revenue stream is supposed to pay for that project, the city council at some point would have to agree to pay for that project through city funds, whether that be through sales tax, lodging tax, mills tax. So that's how that money flows to the IDA. As far as council being able to override the IDA, once again, it depends on the project. I think it's a yes and no. It just depends on the project as whether or not who could override who.
Well, what is this $35 million the IDA has control of? I'm not quite sure of that.
They don't necessarily have control of anything. What that $35 million is the debt that's associated with the revenue bonds. And that's not money sitting in an IDA account or anything like that. I mean, that's just strictly debt. And the way that is paid, the sales tax revenue, property tax revenue, other taxes that's generated in phase 1 of the falls, comes to the city, and then the city is a conduit that sends it back out to a trustee. And that's how the debt on the revenue bonds are paid.
Okay. All right, now I have one more question, and that will end this particular visit to the podium. Of the 5 councilmen sitting here tonight, January 28, 2020, I have one question. And if you so choose, I would like for you to raise a hand in answer to the question. How many and who of the 5 of you is in favor of Bristol, Virginia being put into Washington County? if you are in favor of Bristol, Virginia being put into Washington County because we can't function anymore, would you raise your hand? All right, let it be noted that on this day, January 28, 2020, all 5 current councilmen are opposed to being put into Washington County. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. All right, now we're on item 1. Public hearing regarding the fiscal year 2020-2021 CDBG and home allocations and 2020 through 2024 CDBG Consolidated Plan. Open the public hearing and staff report.
The City of Bristol, Virginia is an annual recipient of federal funding through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The entitlement monies may be spent to develop or sustain viable urban communities by providing decent housing and a suitable living environment, and by expanding economic opportunities, principally to low to moderate income persons. All entitlement monies are dispersed through the city's CDBG program. The city's award amount is unknown at this time. The city also participates in the Tennessee-Virginia Home Consortium, which also receives HUD funding. The annual allocation for home funding is also unknown at this time. The final annual action plan for the city's CDBG program will be considered by the City Council during a future regularly scheduled council meeting. This public hearing is also to invite any public comments for the required 5-year CDBG Consolidated Plan 2020 to 2024, which is mandated this year. Public notice and comment period were advertised in the Bristol Herald Courier on Friday, January 10th, 2020.
All right, thank you. We have one person who signed up for public comment, and that is Ms. Marnie.
Mr. Mayor, my name is Nancy Marnie. I'm a resident of the city of Bristol, Virginia. I'm a property owner. I pay my tax. I remember back a number of years ago, and it has been a number of years ago, and I don't know what the changes are at this point, but I remember when the CDBG funds were first allocated to the city used a lot of that money to help the infrastructure. I don't know whether it can still be used that way. But the city of Bristol, Virginia, Hugh Cooper was the city manager at that time. And I remember that it saved the city a lot of money because they put in some infrastructure that the city really just could not afford. And it all went to help low and moderate or anybody else, any human being, benefited by the money that was spent. And it really saved the city a lot of money. And then after we had put in sidewalks and pipes and parking places and done all kinds of nice things that we desperately needed, somehow or the other, some people decided, well, we ought to be spending that money in another way. And we kind of got sidetracked. And that money did not always go to or do what it was supposed to do as recently as about 4 or 5 years ago. Now, I know what I'm talking about. So my comments are, number one, keep a very close finger on how that money is spent. Every penny of it. Every penny should be accounted for. There was a time it was not. But I would suggest that the city manager, in trying to keep us on a proper course here, would see if some of that money could be used, to help us out on some things. It is possible that it could, but it needs to be looked into. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. All right, no one else has signed up for public comment, so I'll close the hearing. And item 2 on the agenda is financial policy revision and review staff report.
Thank you. Mayor and members of council, 5 finance policies are presented tonight. These policies have been reviewed multiple times by the Finance Committee. The Finance Committee consists of the mayor, vice mayor, the city manager, the Chief Financial Officer, the Treasurer, the Commissioner of Revenue, the School Superintendent, and the Chief Financial Officer of the schools. These policies are presented with the recommendation of the Finance Committee. The purpose of these policies is to maintain a finance manual that is available in the Finance Department and on the website to the public. These policies guide the city in best financial practices. These policies are reviewed and discussed regularly at Finance Committee meetings and at council meetings. As mentioned earlier, these policies come to council at the recommendation of the Finance Committee. The City Council has previously approved these policies. The fund balance policy was approved in November of 2017, the purchasing policy in November of 2017, the budget policy August of 2017, and the travel, credit card, and comprehensive financial policies were approved in January of 2019. We're going to start with the travel policy. The travel policy establishes clear guidelines for employee travel. Wording has been added that the department head should review allowable charges with the employee prior to travel unless that travel is related to an unforeseen circumstance. Another change, reimbursement will be determined by the federal per diem rates by travel location, with those rates attached to the travel voucher. We will no longer, the recommendation is to no longer use a standard per diem rate of $61 a day, but rather to use the rate that the federal government uses by location. The conference agenda or registration will be attached to the travel voucher so that meals provided will not be subject to reimbursement or an allowed credit card charge. The credit card policy. The policy establishes clear guidelines for items that are charged on city credit cards. It describes what is allowed use of city credit cards related to travel and purchases. It specifically lists certain items that cannot be charged on the city credit card. This policy does require a user agreement to be signed by those departments who have authorization to use credit cards. There were a few minor wording changes to this policy and a change that requires unauthorized charges to be repaid back to the city within 3 business days instead of within 5 business days. The budget policy provides for a balanced budget. Current expenditures are to be funded by current revenues. This policy provides for budget monitoring on a monthly basis. The city utilizes the cash basis of budgeting, which is allowed by Governmental Accounting Standards Board and the Auditor of Public Accounts. There were changes to the budget adjustments piece of this policy. Terminology was added for clarification regarding transfers within departments and council action to decrease the overall budget. The city's fund balance policy. This policy describes the fund balance categories. This policy sets the city goal for unassigned fund balance at 18%. This 18% is unchanged from the previous year. The goal of the unassigned fund balance is to eliminate the annual tax anticipation note borrowings. The changes to this policy are related to fund balance categories above the 18% unassigned fund balance goal. Wording says in the policy amounts could be used for the following. The increased restricted fund balances was removed because these are external restrictions that are not in unassigned fund balance to begin with. So really this is a wording correction. Another change, the combined emergency reserve, the policy change combines the emergency reserve and the capital reserve into one reserve with a reserve goal of $5 million and requires only a majority vote of council, not a supermajority, to transfer these funds. These changes are consistent with presentations from credit rating agencies that have discussed what they look for in reserves. They have presented that they look for liquidity and flexibility with reserves, meaning they are not so restricted that the government can't access them if needed. They favor flexible reserves. This would still require council action to release these monies. In addition to the policy is the debt service reserves. The committee felt like this was a needed addition and discusses the sufficiency of the debt service reserve. The final policy we will discuss tonight is the financial policies policy. There are no recommended changes to this policy. The purpose of this policy is to insulate the city from a fiscal crisis. It serves as a guide for decisions that have a significant fiscal impact. This policy promotes long-term financial stability. This policy directs attention to the total financial picture of the city. This policy establishes the guide to ensure sound financial management. Another purpose of this policy is to protect the city's credit rating. It lists the city's goal is to achieve a AAA credit rating, the highest credit rating for a local government. This will require significant fiscal discipline by the city, but the Finance Committee still feels like the city's goal ought to be the best, AAA. Currently, we are rated by Moody's at A3, which is an improvement, a significant improvement from the Baa2 previous. This policy limits the maximum overall legal and moral obligation debt, and this policy will be reviewed and presented to council by January 31st of every year. The Finance Committee and the policy states, and it's very important that council is aware of these policies, so that is why this policy is being presented tonight, even though there is no change. The revenue section of this policy addresses revenue collections to monitor that all taxes are collected timely and accurately. It states that a reassessment will be completed by the city every 4 years. Revenue forecasts will be conservative, but they'll be accurate as well. Restricted revenues shall only be used for the intended purpose, and the city will limit the use of one-time revenues to one-time expenditures such as non-recurring items. Unless related to carryover funds, the use of unassigned fund balance should not be used to finance current operations without specific approval by council as a regular agenda item. The expenditure section of the policy states that one-time expenditures should be funded with an offsetting revenue or item from an adequately funded reserve. Ongoing expenditures will be monitored in comparison with appropriations. The city will seek to optimize the efficiency and effectiveness of all services. And department heads will be responsible for managing expenditures within the operating budget. City has a separate budget policy which details the specifics of the budget process. The budget is listed in this policy for financial policy completeness. The city's budget will be balanced. Ongoing and stable revenues will be used to support our operating costs. Monthly reports comparing actual revenues and expenditures to budgeted amounts will be prepared monthly and distributed to departments. Budget adjustments between line items may be authorized by the city manager within that department, and council must approve supplemental appropriations. The capital improvement program section of the policy requires a five-year capital improvement plan. The program consists of two components. The capital plan, which lists the items the locality anticipates needing within the next 5 years, and the capital budget, which the city manager will present annually to council for approval. The debt section of the policy is the largest section of this policy and sets the guidelines for making financial decisions related to debt. The city does not intend to issue tax anticipation notes, but this section allows that if the timing of revenues requires the issuance of these notes, the notes may be issued as outlined in a budget ordinance. There are two debt ratios listed in the policy. Even though state law allows the issuance of GO debt up to 10% of the assessed value of property, this policy restricts the city to 5% of assessed value of property for GO debt. The ceiling for debt as a percentage of operating expenditures within each fund is set in the policy at 8%. Compliance with these policies will be calculated every year and provided to council with the proposed budget. They will be available to the public in the budget document, and this was followed for the 1920 budget that we're in now. The long-term debt policy describes when the city may use debt. It also lists the criteria for evaluating funding for capital improvements. The policy states that under no circumstance is it recommended to issue long-term debt obligations for private enterprise projects where business plans and market risk play a significant role in the economic outcome of the project. The last section of the policy is financial reporting. The section states that the city's financial statements will conform to generally accepted accounting standards as established by the Government Accounting Standards Board. The city will maintain an accounting system to allow for the accurate and timely preparation of financial statements. Audit results will be presented to council for acceptance annually. The Finance Committee will regularly review the financial activity of the city and may report to council any areas of significant concern by its members. Monthly financial statements will be distributed to council. Quarterly financial updates will be provided to council. Compliance ratios will be presented in the budget document, and at a minimum, this will consist of 2 years of actual audited data, the current year ratios, and the ratios proposed in the budget. This concludes the presentation of the financial policies. The Finance Committee recommends that council approve these policies as presented. Thank you.
All right, thank you. As there was no one signed up for public comment, and we'll get to this council discussion after this, we're looking for a council motion and a second to approve financial policies as presented, including travel, credit card usage, budget, fund balance, and financials.
Make a motion to approve.
I'll second.
Okay, so a motion from Mr. Farnham and a second from Mr. Hartley. Council discussion.
Where you talked about the the debt and the funding, can you go back and give us clarity on that, that's talking about taking on long-term debt? Right there, under no, right there.
Yes, as we developed this policy in the committee last year and presented to council last year, this was the wording that, that the committee members felt. We actually needed this strong of verbiage in the policy to safeguard the assets of the city going forward. At that time, Councilmember Mumpower was on the Finance Committee, and I believe, if my memory serves, that he actually helped formulate these words, as did Councilman Hartley. And it's important that it's in our policy now. And they really felt like, as did the entire committee, that this would serve as a safeguard for the city of Bristol.
So a little history behind the thought that went into that to kind of
See, I'd like to
explain.
see shall in there.
Well, you can never say shall because of elected officials changing and law changing, but because of the history of the city, we felt like a strong statement in there had to be said to say, look, we've got a history that we have gotten ourselves into private economic enterprise projects that have long-term obligations, and there's no way you can predict the market and the risk in the market, and you shouldn't put the city in a position, right, of that kind of risk. And so we were saying it to recommend, because that's all you can do is recommend, because if you say shall, you can, just like we're doing tonight, you can just vote it and change the policy, right? As a warning for others when they read the policy, as a reminder where we were and what you really got to think about before you obligate this city for any kind of long-term debt.
Okay.
And I'd go a step further. I think when you think of who looks at these policies, you know, it's, I mean, yeah, you can change them, but it's also, are you following your own policies? So the outside rating agencies, the APA, other people will look to see if you're taking this seriously or you're just passing something to pass it. So, you know, I think that kind of sends a message to those bodies and organizations as well, to back up what you were saying.
Okay, and then my next question is on the per diem for meals, meal allowances. Right now, we're set at $61 a day, and it's talking about going back to federal recommended allowances. What would that equate to in dollars? It would go from 61 to approximately,
Well, some localities or some travel destinations would still be 61. I believe some would be below 61, some would be above 61. I do feel like overall it will have a very immaterial impact on the budget. For example, Roanoke, Virginia Beach are at 61. Richmond is at 66. I don't have an example of one below, but I do believe it's going to have an immaterial impact on the budget because department heads have to travel within the budget they're allowed.
I understand that, but the vast majority of all the travel should be in the state of Virginia by all rights. There may be a time or two when there's not, but by vast majority, it should be in the state of Virginia. I'm not quite sure I understand all this, you know, with the per diem and everything. I did work for a company that had per diem, and they was crazy with their per diem. I loved them. But with it being a locality, I'm more comfortable with a fixed number. And $61 a day is a reasonable amount. Actually, it could be deemed excessive. I mean, you have to remember, you know, if we was a rich community, I'd be okay with, you know, people being able to spend more money out on the road with their meals and everything. But we all have to remember, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remind one more time, that we are truly a poverty-stricken community. 50% of our people receive some kind of social benefits in this city. And we got to change that, and we're working on it, and we will change it. But with that being said, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. We have people in this community that go to work 8 hours a day for $58. And we are allowing 61 to send our employees out just for meals. So I do not want to vote on this to make that even higher.
I didn't understand that you want the 61 to be higher.
No, I do not want to vote on something that would take it higher than 61.
And I think the feedback we heard from employees and committee members was that, for instance, when you go to Richmond, that the federal per diem was higher than the $61 allowed. And I think I know the reason to go to the federal recommended was that, or the federal GSA per diem was so that we were consistent with how we treated travel per employees, that we actually had something to base that off of. And that was the rationale for changing that.
And I can speak to it a little bit. It's all set through the GSA, which is the government agency that sets the per diem. And if you go on their website, you can actually look up any zip code and it'll tell you. And some of them I've seen, you know, because I went on there and just kind of messed around. Some of them are lower than the 61. And obviously, if it's set at just the federal per diem rate, that just gives you a ceiling. That doesn't mean you have to spend that much. I went to Roanoke last fall for the municipal league, and I think maybe my daily was $25. I think I spent on breakfast, lunch, and dinner, maybe, or if that. So it just gives you a more fair way if you're traveling, so you don't just say, hey, I got $61, I'm gonna blow through all of it. You say, you know, it kind of sets it as a sliding scale. But it's interesting to go on the website and look at the different localities. I did find some that were lower than 61.
Because I think the discussion was 2 points. One, that GSA does a lot of research and looks up, you know, the cost, takes inflation things into account, but they also update it annually. So if it's $61, at some point, you're going to have to change. If it's a fixed number, you're going to have to change that. If you stick with the GSA, then you don't have to keep going back every year and updating your policy to take inflation into account. They've already done that as well. One thing that's in the policy that I think Ms. Spradlin mentioned, but was, to make it to where you meet with the department head beforehand and review all this, and so that the $61, I mean, if you're getting breakfast or lunch at the convention, so you're going for a conference, then, that is noted, so then, you don't have to pay, as the mayor said, that full amount, because your lunch is taken care of at the conference. And so, all of that's kind of gone over beforehand, and people know more or less the boundaries they can be within, but, this just sets the maximum limit. But hopefully they will sit down and go over that before they go, and the department head to have a sense as well.
And I'd also say that when you pull up the GSA table, it gives a recommended amount for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So if lunch is provided, and let's say they say that lunch in that area should cost $20, and the lunch is provided, you take $20 off of whatever that per diem is for that city. So like Richmond's 66. If lunch is provided at a conference, then the employee can spend up to 46 on breakfast and dinner.
Would you say a good amount of other localities have gone from a fixed amount to the percentage?
I would say it's probably even from the peers that I've discussed. I will tell you that one neighboring county has a flat rate, and it's markedly higher than 61 or 66. So we felt like the per diem, the federal per diem was appropriate for our needs.
And that was the recommendation of the Finance Committee?
That's
Yes.
I guess my next question is, has the 61 proven not to be sufficient?
We have heard some feedback, limited feedback, because our employees generally do not provide a lot of negative feedback of some localities where they travel to, and they felt like that the 61 was not sufficient, specifically Richmond. And I know we're just talking about a $5 difference there, but that was some of the feedback we heard.
So having operated under the federal and the state per diem for years and made hundreds and hundreds of trips, okay? The federal rate is high, okay? It is a maximum, that's true. It does change per zip code because it's more expensive in Chicago than it is in Bristol, that's true. But it's an abuse system. It is not the amount you need to travel on day to day. So people will take advantage of the fact that they can spend up to the max, and they will. And that's more than 70% always spend to the max. You just see it, right? And you question why they do it, because we all know it doesn't matter where you travel, $5, $6, $7 for breakfast, $10, $12 for lunch, and $14, $15 for dinner. You could eat easily on $30, $32. It's a fact. So they give you $50, $60, sometimes $70, $80 to go to some of these cities, which is not needed. So it is abused, and employees know it. They know they can spend up to the max, and they do it. So they almost applaud when they go to a conference and there's lunch provided, because that's another $15 they can go get a steak and lobster dinner, that evening. So hang on a second. I'm saying in general. I'm not saying specific. So in general, the per diem model is abused, right? It's always been abused. Not everybody abuses it, but it's been abused. You would spend a lot less over time if you had a more restrictive travel policy by setting some kind of a reasonable number, right? So I do agree with what you're saying. Since most people do travel in the state, we could set a rate of whatever, $40, $50, right, for state travel. But there are people, including the city manager, that have traveled to Chicago or Las Vegas, which, you'd have to make some adjustments for that. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to put an employee in a position to where they really are there and it is really expensive for whatever reason and they're having to pay out of their pocket. But, so you could change the policy to where it's it's a per diem on the federal rate if you travel outside of the state of Virginia, and it's a flat rate based on what the city sets, if you travel inside the state. Because we know this state pretty well, and we could figure out, what a reasonable amount is. But I do agree it's a little high.
I just want to add that we do require the conference agenda or registration be attached to the travel voucher so that meals that are provided by the conference are reduced, deducted from the per diem, as Mr. Eads detailed how that process works. But that was an addition to the policy from last year.
I guess my point that I really want to stress and make is I think 61 is more than sufficient, and I would not like to see that increase because we've got people out here in this community working hard every day that don't even make this kind of money.
I would say, too, gentlemen, that I sign every single receipt that comes through, and I can say, sitting right here, I really have not seen many abuses. If I do see an abuse, I take care of it immediately. Regardless of whether or not 61 is high, I do think our employees recognize the financial shape of the city when they do travel, and I think they are cognizant of that. I think there's been 2 occasions in my 3 years here that I've seen where I had serious reservations about the situation, and we remedied that really quickly. And in regards to my travel, I doubt if I've ever spent, I know for a fact that probably 95% of the meals when I'm on travel, I pay for out of my own pocket. So there's probably been a couple of occasions where I've paid for it with city funds.
And just for clarity, all alcohol that's consumed is on their dime, correct?
Do what now?
Absolutely.
All alcohol consumed would be
Oh,
on
that's
their
correct.
dime.
It's a
Yes.
prohibited item in our list.
We
It's a-
look at every itemized receipt. We have an itemized receipt from where everything is purchased. If they don't have an itemized receipt, they're required to get one, and if they cannot get one, they're paying for that out of their pocket.
It is listed as a prohibited item in our policy.
And correct me if I'm wrong, we even have it set on how much we can reimburse for tipping at restaurants. too.
Yes,
That's correct.
it's limited.
15%, sorry.
It's limited to 15%. And that is strictly followed. If it is more than 15%, the employee has to reimburse that to the city.
Okay. And council has to vote on this?
Yes, we do.
Well, I've got
Okay.
some other questions. Was there somewhere in here on what the reimbursement of mileage is at the IRS rate of 55
Yes.
cents? Is that right?
Yes, it lists mileage reimbursement as the IRS rate, which did change January 1st.
So you do know the state does not reimburse at the IRS rate. They
I did
reimburse
not
at
know that.
.246 per
I
mile.
did not know that.
So any state employee that's traveling can only be reimbursed at 24.6 cents per mile. So if you travel beyond, what's reasonable for your mileage to get reimbursed, so you take the 25 cents, you go 400 miles, that's $100, right? So they're going to expect you to go get a rental car, right? And fuel if you're going 400 miles, because you can go get a rental car for $35, $40 and $40 of gas and be, better off than paying the 800 miles round trip, if you have to go to Hampton Roads back and forth. So the state, I'll just say that it's more restrictive on the mileage than what we've got laid out here.
Actually, that our travel policy states that a system-owned vehicle has to be used, that you can only take your personal owned vehicle if you have prior approval by the city manager. And I will tell you that we have very, very, very few isolated instances of mileage reimbursement in the city per year.
Okay, well, they won't even let you take your personal vehicle if a rental vehicle is available.
We're talking 5 times a year.
Yeah,
I
I'm
mean,
just-
it's
I'm
very
just-
limited.
I'm just pointing out the
And it does
differences.
require prior approval.
On the budget, balanced, are we taking all of the IDA items that we've been discussing over the last hour and a half and show that in a budget line item position? Can you explain that to the community where we look at all of the debt obligations, including what we have on the IDA books, and when we look at, and we say we've got a balanced budget, how we're showing that, so it's very clear to folks, how much the IDA is carrying as total debt obligation that they have, issued out.
The budget is prepared on the cash basis of outflows, estimated outflows. It is not based on total debt of an entity. So in our budget, you will see a line item that shows transfers to the IDA, which this year, in the current year fiscal 20, makes up the administrative fee to service the IDA debts. With recent happenings, we anticipate that in fiscal year 21, that line item will increase to the estimated total obligation for the city for fiscal year 21.
Okay.
So the actual payment and what we estimate, it's an estimate, will be the total anticipated obligation that the city of Bristol has for that IDA Series A debt.
Right, so basically what you're saying is there's a debt amount out here on the IDA, and so all you're seeing on our budget side is a transfer of the dollar amount to pay the debt service.
Yes.
On that total. So that, and we'll talk about good financial management, that's another thing we should be very cognizant of. That's a very risky way of managing something financially, because you don't really have a feel, you're not seeing the number, the breakdown of that total debt obligation that's sitting there that you're paying against. And so we got to figure out, do we want to approve a policy that has a blind eye to that, or do we want to change the policy to where that is clearly visible to everyone, not just the amount we're transferring to pay the debt, but what that total debt obligation is, for each project, because you can easily, get a group to get a amount of debt there that is way higher than you ever expected, and then you wonder how you got there with no means of backing out of it. So you need to kind of see both pictures. What's out there, what are we paying against it, and then you start asking questions of, when is this debt obligation going to be paid down? What's the call on it? When's the end of the term on this one, and so forth? You're better to manage that debt picture.
Total debt balances are reported annually in the CAFR. They're not reported as part of the budget. I don't know that we need a policy that states that, because they are reported in the CAFR, but certainly management can add that information to the budget document outside of the policy.
And then why do we change from a 4-1 vote down to a 3-2 vote? What was the logic behind that?
So as we've heard, credit rating agencies, one of the things what do they look for in reserves? And let me be very clear, Moody's doesn't present and say this is exactly what the city of Bristol should do. They don't do that, but they do talk in generalities. And I have had the opportunity to hear them present multiple times this year. And they talk about, what do we look for in reserves? They look for liquidity and they look for flexibility. Meaning, are they so restricted that if the locality needs to access them, they can't? And are they so identified by source that if there's a problem over here, they can't be used because they're sitting over here? So what we did was combine the emergency reserve and the capital into one, and with the goal to fund those reserves as we have monies available, and to reduce the supermajority vote down to a simple majority. And let me be very clear, we have 1.4 million in an emergency reserve right now that was put into emergency reserve by council that requires a supermajority vote to release those monies. That will not change. For that 1.4 to be released, that will require a supermajority vote. So the thinking was that for additional reserved monies committed by council, that a simple majority was enough to move those monies if need be.
Okay, well, I'll just say I think that's another bad idea. I think we did the 4-1 vote for a reason. We're trying to make it not completely inflexible. There's still flexibility because a 4-1 vote still allows it to go forward, but it puts a very immediate amplification to what you're doing when you got a 4-1 vote. It causes a lot more focus and a lot more discussion about that item. Do we really want to do that or not? Because we put it in an account with a 4-1 vote for a reason. We just don't want, any kind of a project to come up that says 3-2 vote can start moving it from that account and do something with it. So that loses the discipline of good financial discussion and management. And so I don't like going from 4-1 to 3-2. I think that's the wrong direction. I think that's a bad move. All right, next item, financial policy. When you go to the financial policy that was in our packet, right? I gotta flip over here.
Yes, this policy was unchanged from previously adopted policy, the financial policy.
Yeah, but I still had a few questions. I wanted to point out a few things. One, under the policy objectives, right, on item D, to direct attention to the total financial picture of the city rather than single issue areas, and link long-term financial planning with day-to-day operations. So is your definition, is our definition as a city total financial picture? Does that include everything we look at on the budget, on the revenue and expenditure side, as well as everything that the IDA has obligations for in total? Because to me, that is a total financial picture. You can't look at just a portion of it because there are some legal and moral obligations tied. So my question is, has there been any discussion on item D there that anything would be excluded from the total financial picture we make note of there?
There has been no discussion that anything would be excluded from that.
So everything would be included in.
There's not been any specific exclusion.
Okay. Item F, to protect the city's credit rating and provide for adequate resources to meet the provisions of the city's current and future debt obligations on all municipal debt, including general obligation debt and moral obligation debt. So that item F, we should really understand, we have got to, as a city and a council and a management staff, go out and make very specific requests to get our credit rating looked at as you take on any kind of a project that's got substantial financial liability. So we've heard both sides of the equation. I'm not going to read the letters, but I can if I need to. That back in October, Davenport gave a letter with bond counsel involved where there were some concerns, right, on how the school construction PPA financing would be looked at. And there was no hard evidence one way or another, but there was serious concern there about how the credit agencies would view that. A couple comments made in that letter were very profound. One is, there's never been a project like this to this magnitude done in the state of Virginia. And so when credit agencies see the amount of money we're talking about of 18 to 20 million and the interest, that does raise a lot of questions when they start to review our financial picture. So as we talk about a PPA, as we talk about the IDA and how monies are going to flow, we have an obligation to go out and pay for a credit agency credit assessment before we obligate the city to any more debt, whether it be lease obligations or not. And then further in this policy, I think we made note that we consider in this policy moral obligation as debt. And moral obligation as debt is to be included in the calculation for our debt ratios. So that means anything we take on, that has to be presented. So the CFO in the city is required to run those numbers and show us annually what those debt ratios look like. So if you start to add, whether it be a lease, a purchase lease, and the way these words are, clearly the PPA is a purchase lease moral obligation. That amount per the policy would have to be included in that calculation. And when you run those numbers, that debt ratio is moving the other direction. It's going up. So we have to understand what we're telling the world in our financial policies here and how those calculations work. Because we can't say it one way and then discount it and not include it in another vein. So that is a conflict and a dilemma in the way this policy statement in this financial policy is written right now.
Do want to tell you the debt ratio policies, the ceiling is pretty clear. It says general obligation debt as a percentage of assessed value. Just wanted to add that. Once
There's
again,
one
there-
statement, let me
once
just
ag-
point to the one statement here. So under
Once again, this policy's not changed.
Under debt ratio policies on page 7 and flip over to page 8, right? It says, in the very last sentence of that paragraph, any long-term debt financing lease obligations which may be subject to annual appropriation, which the PPA is, we have to annually appropriate money to the school system to make those payments, by the city will also be included in the calculation of tax-supported debt service. So you can't sit there and shake your head no. It's right there.
I don't think I was shaking my head no.
I didn't say you were. I saw
thought you were
others
talking
shaking
to
their head
me.
no.
No, I was nodding my head up and down. I wasn't nodding my head
So
no.
we're not going to get
And-
into the business as a city to not include debt obligations we're taking on.
I know, but I don't
I'm not
want-
speaking to you, I'm speaking to everyone in the audience.
Well, I think you said the obligation of the CFO, and I don't want there ever to be any thought that the chief financial officer of the city of Bristol is not presenting information like the policy
No, I actually saw
state.
the superintendent of schools shaking his head no.
Okay, I thought you
That's
were
what I
talking
was
to me.
No, I was
Sorry.
not talking to you.
Because I think I was instrumentally involved in developing these policies, and I will tell you, are policies perfect? Absolutely not. I will tell you they are heads and tails different
Right.
from where we were just a few short years ago. I absolutely think we can improve on every policy we have. That being said, these did go through the Finance Committee for recommendations, and these policies as presented are the recommendation of the Finance Committee.
And what I'm saying is I'm
sir.
telling the council and the city management staff, based on the PPA and things facing us, we should take a pause and make sure the language in this policy is matching what we now know is in front of us. And if we don't do that, we're approving a policy without taking those other things into consideration.
All right. Is there any other discussion? We got anything else?
Before you call for the vote, I will say one thing that's good about this is we came up with these policies. I think we first adopted them last year, and with the goal of annually reviewing them and bringing them before council before we get into the budget season. And so that is a good step forward. As Ms. Bradlin said, you can always look at a policy and strive to make it better, but to have this as part of this ongoing budget process is a good thing and a good way to start the budget process, that you have these policies in place to move forward.
Yeah, I appreciate the CFO's work on this. I know we spent a lot of hours up there in that conference room going through this on Thursday mornings, and sometimes we're all, half awake when we get in there, but we get going and figure out what we're talking about. So I appreciate it. And I think if you go and read through the full text of these financial policies, it is a pretty fiscally responsible setup that you have, and you are tightening the belt on some things, and we appreciate it. So if there's nothing else, the clerk will call the roll, please.
Farnham.
Yes.
Mumpower.
No.
Wingard.
No.
Hardley.
Yes.
Osborne.
Yes. All right, item 3 is capital improvement plan, staff report.
Council, as we get into the capital improvement plan, at the last meeting, I requested budget goals, and I received budget goals from each and every one of you for this upcoming fiscal year, so I think it's important to discuss that as we start moving into the capital improvement plan. I want to go back to the definition that's set out in the Code of Virginia as to what a budget is and what it requires. The governing body shall prepare and approve a budget for informative and fiscal planning purposes only, containing a complete, itemized, and classified plan of all contemplated expenditures and all estimated revenues and borrowings for the locality for the ensuing fiscal year. The budget remains a working document throughout the process based on historical data, trends, and projections. Budget goals from Councilman Farnham. 1, have a balanced budget with a conservative approach that will allow us to put more money into our emergency reserve fund. 2, continue to fund our outside nonprofit agencies to the best of our ability. 3, no increase in property taxes. 4, continue to support our school system with no decrease in funding. And 5, landfill minimize rate increases. Councilman Wingard said fund the city attorney position. Mayor Neil Osborne stated 7 goals. 1, continue the policy of storing away money in the reserve fund to plan for future debt payments. 2, hiring additional police officers and firefighters, preferably 2 for each department. 3, increase funding for outside agencies, CVB, Believe in Bristol, BCM. 4, support for the school system in the way of a plan to return some of the $300,000 that was cut in fiscal year 18-19. 5, find a way to set aside additional funds for capital improvement needs. 6, continue working toward the goal of the landfill being self-sufficient. 7, craft a detailed plan for utilizing increased tax revenues from any large economic growth projects that sets aside a certain percentage for the debt payments as well as big projects and needs throughout the city. Councilman Hartley provided about 10 goals under 2 headings. 1, planning for the future. If you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. Continue to set aside funds to anticipate increased debt payments. Budget sufficient funds to make up for shortfall due to the Cabela's closure and a Series A revenue bonds. Continue to maintain and build up reserves to enable the city to mitigate potential risk. Continue to make solid waste disposal fund more self-sustaining, particularly as it regards to collections, making sure to set aside funds for accrued expenses and future liabilities. Continue to implement a capital plan. Use one-time funding for large needs while setting aside a portion of recurring revenues to deal with recurring needs, i.e. automobiles, computers, servers, cars, and other major equipment. Moving away from capital leases and borrowing while also setting up a replacement schedule for these recurring capital items. 2, strategic investments. Quote, don't judge each day by the harvest you reap, but by the seeds that you plant. Develop a funding formula to adequately fund outside agencies that market and support the city's economic development efforts. Use recovered costs from the ambulance service to reinvest into recruitment, retention, and other resources to allow the fire department to better serve our citizens. 3, fully staff police and fire at budgeted levels to avoid increased overtime. 4, continue to review and implement ways to reduce inmate costs at the jail. 5, invest in our employees by continuing to provide training and professional development and examining options to reduce any employee increases for insurance. Councilman Mumpower, 1, establish a max limit for total outside agency funding, a % of police, fire, public works, parks and rec, city portion of school, only non-revenue generating departments. For number 2, for each department budget total, publish a summary report that shows how the department trial budget amount compares as a % of total budget. 3, fund a city attorney position. 4, establish a city building maintenance and refurbishment crew that reports to the public works director, the city engineer, and remove the school maintenance budget from the school allocation. In other words, we would pull school maintenance into the city, and the city would then take care of the school maintenance issues, and that would not be taken care of by the school system anymore. 5, purchase of property in Lee Highway for the future new fire hall. 6, achieve a 2.5% overall cost reduction by a reorganization of the city department structures. 7, establish formal advisory groups for fiscal year 20 and 21. The groups would be a landfill break-even group, a city total financial metric system, a continuous improvement program, and an industry-based growth enhancement. 7, fund specific legal actions. 8, capital, buy small, low-cost electric vehicles for downtown police and neighborhood patrols for a new lower-cost way of delivering public safety. 9, set up a restricted school construction and building maintenance fund. 10, restrict the top-line revenue estimates to the last 3-year average, reduced by a % that aligns with what happened in 2007 through 2010. And that was the goals that we received from City Council. Do you all want to discuss any of those at this time, or do you want me to move on into the capital improvement plan?
Go ahead.
Council, tonight is the first introduction of the capital improvement plan for fiscal year 21 through 25. We've been working on this plan since October with designated department heads to review and score each one of the projects that you'll see presented here tonight. The capital improvement plan contains of two components, the capital plan and the capital budget. Items with a total cost greater than $5,000 and a useful life greater than 1 year are what constitute capital items. The committee members were myself, the Chief Financial Officer, the Director of Public Works, Police Chief, Fire Chief, Sheriff, City Engineer, and the IT Manager. The capital improvement plan, and I've lost my paper copy, so it may be a second for me to read it. Here's a flow chart. As I get older, I can't see as well. The capital improvement item worksheets are submitted to the Capital Improvement Committee. Then the Capital Improvement Committee prioritizes capital improvement items and prepares a capital plan listing anticipated capital items for the next 5 years. A capital improvement plan is then prepared and presented to the city manager. The city manager presents the capital improvement plan to council, which is what we're doing tonight. And the Capital Improvement Committee monitors capital improvement expenditures and how they are adhering to the city's long-range plans and vision. This year we had 56 items that were submitted by departments. We finalized that down to 50 items, and there's a variety of reasons why 6 were not considered. Those were scored by individual committee members. Then we aggregated the scores and ranked those according to a score. The committee reviewed the ranking for accuracy of the ranking and to make sure that we understood exactly how we ranked each one of those projects in relation to other projects, and the adjustments were made for final presentation here tonight. The assessment criteria that we use to determine how we rank each individual projects: 1, the item contributes to the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens. 2, the item that was needed to comply with either state, local, or federal law. 3, the item needed to conform to an adopted program, policy, or plan. 4, item remediates an existing or projected deficiency. 5, item contributes to long-term needs of the community. 6, the service area of the item. So is that item, is it a regional service, a citywide, or just several neighborhoods or a neighborhood project? Department priority, and then items deliver a level of service that is desired by the community. So as we move through this, what you will see, let me pull this up. You will see the next 5 fiscal years lined out. The top line there, transfers from the general fund. In fiscal year 21, we anticipate moving $985,415 from the general fund into the capital improvement plan. There'd be $2.1 million from state funding, $7.1 million from federal funding, for a total funding of $10.3 million. You can see a summary in this upcoming year. $574,331 goes to public safety. $9.5 million goes to infrastructure, which the majority of that would be paid for by state and federal funds. And then $313,000 is vehicle replacement, which is something that we put into the budget last year, and that will continue to increase this year and next year and the following year until we have $480,000 a year going to vehicle replacement, which would then we would have extinguished all of our capital leases for vehicles, with the exception of several vehicles at the landfill, which are large ticket items. So you can see as we move forward how we are projecting what the cost will be from the general fund for those capital items that are needed. Local funds for fiscal year 20 would be $399,427 for local capital, and for local vehicle was $226,000. That's the fiscal year that we're currently in. That was a total of $625,000 for this current fiscal year. Upcoming, $672,415 would be needed for local capital projects. $313,000 additional would be used for vehicles, for a total of $985,415. And the percent of the general fund is 1.83% of the general fund, and it's a budget increase from the prior year of $359,988. We have discussed in previous council meetings on numerous times what a healthy capital improvement budget would be of the general fund, and we have all agreed, and based on what other localities do across the Commonwealth, that is about 3% of a budget. So at 3% of our current budget is roughly $1.68 million, and that's where we will eventually get in fiscal year 24. These are the capital improvement projects that are fully funded. They're infrastructure projects. You have a Bonham Road, Paulina Drive sidewalk, Lee Highway, Old Airport intersection. Euclid Bob Morrison signal with a pedestrian light, the Lee Highway shared use path from Overhill to Clover, the Fairview Street Bridge improvements, Goodson Street Bridge replacement, Oak Street Bridge, Martin Luther King Bridge rehab, and an Old Airport Road sidewalk project. And these are fully funded by outside funds, not from local funds. And you can see how these projects continue to go over the next several fiscal years and when they would be completed. So here are the items that local funds would be used for this upcoming fiscal year. We have the Lee Highway Exit 5 Phase 1B is $39,874. That's our portion that we have to put up in regards to that project, and that is with the widening and the change of the interchange there at Exit 5. The Sheriff's Office jail plumbing is $160,000, and that's for plumbing issues that are currently at the local jail. The Bonham Road shared use path of $13,210. That is the piece that we have to put up for that Bonham Road shared use path. Police is the audio recorders of $30,000. Streets and roads, drainage improvements of $45,000. If I'm not mistaken, those funds come from the Stormwater Maintenance Fund. Is that correct, Wallace? No? Okay, I'm sorry.
This is the local share this is the maintenance that's not covered by our state funds.
Okay, sorry. And then the fire department, personal protective equipment of $30,000. And then the sheriff's department, the heating and air conditioning at the jail of $354,331. However, you will also see in fiscal year 22, there would be an additional roughly $82,000 for that project. So you're looking at a total of roughly $440,000 for that HVAC system at the jail. So this year it'd be a total of $672,415. And that is the capital plan as presented. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions about any of those items.
All right, I think we'll do the public comment, and then we'll get to your questions and council discussion.
Okay.
So for public comment, we have one person signed up, and that is Ms. Marnie.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, my name is Nancy Marnie. I live at 526 Euclid. I'm a resident of the city of Bristol, Virginia. I'm a property owner. Somehow or the other, I still have the feeling that we're living beyond our means. I do not question the legitimacy of what I've just heard. I do not question the hard work and thought that went into it. But I do question whether this city is continuing to live beyond our means. We are not Darien, Connecticut. We are not Grosse Pointe, Michigan. We are not Palm Beach. We are a low-income city. We are an older city. We have limited resources. We have certain needs that the city is supposed to require by virtue of its existence for the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens. That's what a city does. Now, anything beyond that is a matter of choice. And I still question whether we are thinking things through to the right extent where we are really making good choices. I think we're living beyond our means. We don't know who we are, where we're headed, or anything about it, how we're going to get there. Now, you have already indicated you are opposed to being in Washington County, as I am. But if you're not careful, you being our city officials, you are leading us by your decisions right straight into Washington County. They don't even want us. But your decisions will determine that in large measure. I don't want to hear a thing about the economic development I don't want to hear anything about the economy and all that stuff. Your decisions are what make the difference. Now, you are the stewards of what the previous council did. The previous council did a brilliant job of getting this city situated so that we could try to get out of this deep, dark hole we got ourselves into. That was very obvious upstairs. The city council prior to this one did a brilliant job. I never saw anything better in all of my life. It was difficult, but that council had the maturity, the experience, the knowledge, the know-how, and the backbone to do what it took to get this city on a productive path. Now, what you as the stewards should be doing is stay the course. What was set up by the last council is working. Check the figures. Some of them came out upstairs tonight. She can give you others. Check the figures, folks. What the previous council put in place can be and should be followed. It works. It will work. But you have to plant your feet and get your head screwed on straight and decide you want it to work. Or we will soon be Bristol, Washington County. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. So we'll open it up to council discussion. I want to start out with a question to the city manager. So you said at the beginning, you were talking about how these projects were scored, and you got that criteria, I think. So were these, explain some more about how they were scored. Were these weighted in any way? Like say, like health, safety, welfare, and compliance with the law, were those weighted more heavily than delivers a level of service desired by the community, or were they all weighted equally, or what was the process?
Well, what we did, I wish I had my scoring sheet with me. She's gonna pull this up real quick. So every item had, like, takes, for instance, the project contributes to the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So you could score up to 5 points on any given one of these items. And this particular item, there were certain categories. 1, it eliminates a known hazard, that gets 5 points. 2, it eliminates a potential hazard, would get 4 points. 3, it materially contributes to the health, safety, and welfare, would get 3 points. If it minimally contributes, it gets 1 point. If it would have no impact, it gets 0 points. If the item was needed to comply with local, state, or federal law, a yes received 5 points, a no received 0 points. If it needed to conform to an adopted program, policy, or plan, it went, if it was consistent with the adopted city council policy or plan, it got 5 points. If it was consistent with an administrative policy, it was 3 points. If there was no policy or plan in place, it receives 0 points. If the project remediated an existing or projected deficiency, if it completely remedied the problem, it received 5 points. If it partially remedied the problem, it received 3. If it didn't do anything to the problem, it received 0 points. If it contributes to the long-term needs of the community, if it was more than 30 years, it got 5 points, 21 to 30, 4 points, 11 to 23 points, 4 to 10 years, 2 points, 3 years or less, only received 1 point. If it was a service area of the item or project, if it was regional, it was 5 points. If it was citywide, it was 4 points. If it was several neighborhoods, 3 points. And if it was one neighborhood or less, only 1 point. Department priority, if it was mandatory, it was 5. Improved efficiency was 4. Maintenance was 3. And a new service was 1 point. And if it delivered a service desired by the community, if it was a high level of service that was desired by the community, it received 5. If it was a medium, it received 3 points. And if it was a low service to the community, it received 1 point. And then we scored those, and the finance department went through and took an average from all 6 or 8 individuals that were on the committee, and that's how it was eventually ranked, which you saw on the spreadsheet previously.
So in the packet, so on, I don't know if you've got the same, you probably have the same stuff. On this page for, where we're talking about the local projects, where you've got our portion of the Lee Highway Exit 5, the jail plumbing, the HVAC and all that.
Yes.
So this part I'm asking about is not on the slide, but it goes down for fiscal years 21, 22, 23. So some of these that are listed for capital needs, like for fiscal year 22, it's got fire department storage building. It doesn't have a price.
Hold on, let me pull that sheet up, sorry. I got it. You can go ahead while I get
It
it.
says page 35. I don't know if that helps you.
If we were unable to have a cost, we still went ahead and discussed the project and ranked it, and you see the placement in the program where it fell according to rank. Sometimes we were just unable to get even a reasonable estimate of the cost, but we felt like rather than just take that out of the plan, we at least needed to rank it and score it so that, so it could be discussed.
And that will be scored again next year.
Yeah.
At some point, there were several projects where I directed department heads, you need to get a better price, whether that requires quotes or an RFP process. They'll go out this year, get that done. That way, next year when they come back, we've got a better score. So what you might see in fiscal year 24 may move up to fiscal year 22.
So these are all fluid, just depending upon
It's
the
fluid
actual
depending
needs.
on the situation.
Okay.
Yeah, that was kind of going to be my question. This is the second year we've done this. So how many projects carried? Do you rescore? Like last year you did this. Do you go back and rescore all the projects? Like if it was something we couldn't get to last year, but we said that's a high priority, so we'll put it in the next year. Do you go back and rescore it compared to everything else, or how do you, when you're looking at a 5-year plan, how do you deal with some of those things that get in the out years?
We leave that up to the department head as to whether or not they want to score it for this period of time this year. Sometimes they came back and were rescored, other times they were not, and they'll just move into the current plan as you see presented on page 35.
Like they would be aware if something was, if you scored the top 5 projects and number 6 got cut, they'd be aware that, hey, this was our
Right,
next
and
option.
this year,
last
all
year.
projects were rescored this year.
Well, I just want to say, I think it's, my thought is, because there's a lot of numbers, and it's a big list. Everyone has their to-do list, whether it's your list of things you need to do at home or at work. And for a while, the city also has a list. And when you don't get things done, the list starts to add up and get bigger and bigger, and it can be overwhelming. And for a while, things didn't get done. But at least we have a plan now, and we have a list, and we're checking items off our list. And as you said, it's fluid. The things that could be 3 or 4 years down the road could be readjusted, rescored, and moved up a year or moved back a year. But I think it's important to realize just a few years ago, there was no list. There was no plan, is my understanding. So at least we have a list, we have a plan, we're working our plan to knock things off our list, because what we have on our list right now, there could be a whole new set of things next year that we don't even know about right now. So, I'm happy to be where we're at as far as the progress we've made, to at least be here where we have our goals and we have a long-term, a 5-year plan.
Can you add the last couple years on the same spreadsheets to show kind of where we were and what the percent change is from those years to the
Like the ones we did
budgets?
last year?
Yeah. It's hard to kind of gauge, the ups and downs. And what'd you say on fire station, this over here, not the storage, but something about a facility? What was that? that's blank, says Station 1 facility, there's no dollar amount?
Okay, there's no dollar amount. That's Station 1. As all of you all are aware, we had issue with some of the outside structure of the building and potential foundation of the building this past September, when we noticed several cracks in the brick and the facade of the building and also in the floor. We had the structural engineers out, they looked at that in September. They gave us a report. That report indicated that we surveyed it. They wanted us to survey it in September, come back in 6 months and survey it again to see if any of that had moved over that period of 6 months. If it had moved at a period of 6 months, the structural engineers would come back in, take a look to determine exactly what is causing that problem. If it hasn't moved, then there's probably, we would resurvey it again in another 6 months and just keep an eye on it to determine whether or not we needed to do anything. The reason you don't see a price on that is because based on the structural engineer's report, it did not create a structural deficiency that required an immediate action. And based on the recommendation that we just resurvey it and keep an eye on it, that's what we're going to do. And at some point, if they tell us something needs to be done, I think we would need to make a decision. One, do we remedy the problem there and leave Station 1 there? Or do we try to find another place for Station 1 somewhere else in the city?
So basically, the long and short of it is, in that situation, unless you go back in March, which is 6 months from when you said the survey was going to happen, unless you go back in March and it's moved 8 inches to the left or something, you're not going to have to plan immediately to do this. So it's not as high as a priority.
That would be up to it'd be up to the structural engineer. If it sank 2 inches, they may say we need to do something. If it sank half an inch, they may say let's just continue to monitor it. And once again, if we had a significant sink in the building, then I would say they would recommend doing something different relatively quickly.
So let me go over back to actually we're on this slide. Let me go to the local vehicle allotment. So once you get up, so right now I know we're in a lot of leases for a lot of vehicles. So once you get up to this 480, you say except for the landfill vehicles, you'll have mostly got out of capital leases.
And the large fire trucks, sorry. Yeah. But yes, we should not have any more capital leases once we get to fiscal year 23.
So beyond 25, would you anticipate that the 480 would stay basically level?
I would anticipate it staying level because what you will see, your police cars are probably the things that need to be replaced the most often. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I know that's probably the things that has to be replaced the most often. There's other vehicles that would need to be replaced, but in the event we only need to replace $200,000 worth of vehicles in 1 year, we could take that $200,000 and put it towards another capital project, or we could put it towards some other type of project that's needed within the city.
And I know you got several vehicles like up at Sugar Hollow in the Parks and Rec Department. I remember when I first got elected, I had you send me a list of all of the vehicles that were owned by the city. And I think there was like a truck that was a 1978 truck or something on there. So there's some stuff that's pretty old. As far as how the things are purchased, correct me if I'm wrong. I remember at some point someone told me that somehow we jump in on the state contract to get certain types of vehicles.
Depends on the vehicle, but we always have that opportunity, which it's generally cheaper when we piggyback on how the state procures things. And when we jump on their RFP process for that, the price is already set for us. We know how much the vehicle is going to cost, and we don't have to go through that process.
I know it's not necessarily realistic maybe with police and fire and public safety vehicles, but as far as like the Parks and Rec and maybe other city vehicles, it'd be good, I think, and we've discussed this at length, to look at, energy efficient hybrid vehicles, That's why I wouldn't say necessarily for the public safety, because they need the speed and the power, but in the long term, you can save some money on gas costs if you have a vehicle that gets more mileage.
And I think that's something we can look at. The thing that we have noticed on those price plans, typically the hybrid, or I haven't seen any electric vehicles, completely electric, but typically the hybrid vehicles cost several thousand more. Now, there's an offset to that potentially depending on how it's built and the type of vehicle. There's a fuel offset, but on the onset, it's more expensive with the hybrid vehicles.
Have you ever looked, I don't know what, they don't give any kind of credit if you get the hybrid vehicles, like some kind of discount for?
No.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Not like for a person, right?
Yeah, okay.
What were your scoring categories again? You went kind of fast through that. Can you go through those one more time?
Items contribute to the health, safety, and welfare of the public. The item is needed to comply either with local, state, or federal law. The item is needed to conform to an adopted program, policy, or plan. The item remediates an existing or projected deficiency. The item contributes to the long-term needs of the community. The service area of the item, is it a regional, citywide, or several neighborhoods service area? Is it a department priority? And does the item deliver a level of service desired by the community?
And you scored them like 1 to 5 or something, you just added them up?
Correct.
Something like that. So how would like a project that's got, you know, some maybe emergent type issues, if you don't fix it, that you could really create a building issue like, and I don't know if this is the case or not, but like the jail plumbing or something like that, is that falling under your health, safety, welfare, so it gets a higher score because if they don't do it, and
That's correct.
thing continues to
Right.
degrade?
Yes.
Okay.
And I mean, just take the jail items, for example. Most of the jail items you see probably received 5s on most of those projects, at least 4 or 5s, simply because of the necessity. One, it's dealing with the health, safety, and welfare of a certain population that's incarcerated. 2, there are certain laws that we have to comply with when we're taking care of inmates. 3, it needs to conform to an adopted program, policy, or plan. And typically the program, policy, or plan when it comes to the jail is the sheriff has to provide a certain level of care to inmates. It remediates an existing or projected deficiency. As it stands right now, there is no air conditioning at the jail and the heating is less than perfect. So that would remediate an existing deficiency. It contributes to the long-term needs of the community because these are long-term projects that would be expected to last for at least no less than 15 years. It is a citywide project. Some may have scored it regional simply because you do have inmates coming from that may not necessarily live in the city but happen to enjoy committing a crime in the city. I can tell you right now that it's a department priority of the sheriff to make sure that that jail is in compliance with everything that needs to be in compliance with. And it does deliver a level of service desired by the community in the simple fact that if there is ever a court order by a federal judge that tells us we have to do something else with our jail, I don't think necessarily the community wants us to have to expend additional funds simply because we didn't take care of a problem.
And I think you could say some of the items on the jail list have been on our list for years, and they just haven't gotten done.
Well, I don't think there was a list for years.
There wasn't even a list,
Now
right?
there's a list, and we're trying to deal with that as it comes to us.
Have you looked at some of these items that might be down in fiscal year 22 or something like the roof at the jail and some of these that or the foundation that we just talked about on Station 1 that could continue to deteriorate faster than we're expecting, and all of a sudden they move up into current fiscal year faster than you would anticipate, and are we kind of taking some kind of a plan to be ready for that? You know, what would we move out if something did move in?
Well, I
kind of
think
thing.
we would just go back and look at the score and say, okay, you know, right now, well, let's just take fiscal year 22. And for example, let's say the jail kitchen update. For whatever reason, everything in the jail kitchen just went, you know, down tonight. We've got to provide food to inmates. So what we would do is we'd say, all right, that's a $35,000 fix. What project up here can be put off another year to allow us to substitute in that jail kitchen update? And let's just take the big ticket item on there, the rec yard cover. Basically, that's a netting system that goes over the current rec yard. What you have are individuals who like to throw in illicit items into that rec yard for inmates to get. The jail's been that way for an extended period of time. Are there other ways to remedy that situation in the short term that it could potentially move down another year in the event something in the following fiscal year needs to be moved up? So we just have to look at those things as they come.
Is there any further discussion? All right, so Next item on the agenda is the consent agenda.
Okay, before we go on with the consent agenda, I want to talk about the consent agenda. If you turn to page 39 in your packet, there was a discussion here in regards to the referendum, and Councilman Mumpower made a motion, and I'm going to read exactly from the minutes, made a motion to authorize the city manager and city attorney to draft the legal language for a citywide referendum to allow the city to approve a comprehensive agreement for the PPEA financing on a consolidated school at the Van Pelt location. Mr. Wingard seconded the motion. There was a discussion had. The motion was voted 3-2. I think, based on comments of everyone in this room, including Councilman Mumpower, who made the motion, at least at the time there was a issue as to whether or not this was a motion to actually have a referendum or whether it was a motion to have me draft the language for the referendum. So, Gene, if you could just play this for a few seconds here. It's about 2.5 minutes.
Roundabouts. There's all kinds of costs that we still do not know, right? So we have time to put a policy together, and I'm okay with that. And we have time to draft language and do it right for a referendum. Which, where we sit today, that's the right thing to do for this community. So with that said, I'm sitting here and I want to make a motion. And I make a motion to authorize the city manager and the city attorney to do language for a citywide referendum to allow the city to approve a comprehensive agreement with PPA financing for a consolidated school at the Van Pelt location. That's my motion.
And I second that.
So we have a motion to vote on a referendum.
Pay attention to this language. Gene, if you could stop that real quick, maybe go back a few seconds. So the mayor restated the motion differently than how it was stated by Mr. Mumpower.
To allow the city to approve a comprehensive agreement with PPA financing for a consolidated school at the Van Pelt location. That's my motion.
And I second that.
So we have a motion to vote on a referendum authorization from Mr. Mumpower and a second from Mr. Wingard. Is there any other further discussion on this?
If you can pause that real quick. So the mayor's recapitulation of that motion was basically for a referendum. And then what you will see here in a few moments is Mr. Farnham asks the question, does this require the 4/5 vote? And at that point, I think you'll see Mr. Mumpower nods his head yes. I don't think there was any other comments made by anyone else at that time. Then I believe Mr. Farnham asked Mr. Mumpower to reread the motion again. I think the mayor at that point stated the motion correctly. And then there was one other question in regards to the 4/5 vote where everyone, and Mr. Mumpower, you even said this does require the 4/5. You didn't say it this way, but you said correct when the question was asked, does this require the 4/5 vote? So we can just play that and everybody see how that plays out.
Well, one question I have is, when we were looking at the charter, we were talking about the procedures and majority and supermajority. And this is for a vote on a referendum, so that would require a supermajority.
This requires supermajority, which is a 4/5 vote.
So at this point, everybody's thinking it's a referendum. Mr. Mumpower nods his head, says that's correct.
Will the clerk call the roll?
So there's more discussion or no?
Is there more discussion?
This is a serious vote.
Yes, it
Absolutely
is.
The
Very
community, the
serious.
community will remember this vote.
I hope they do.
They will
Clerk, call
remember
the roll,
every
please.
single person that voted. So we need to take the time, if necessary, to discuss it further, because this is a serious vote.
You
One of
have
the
any
most
other-
serious votes we've had, probably in,
Do you have any other discussion you want to do before we vote?
I'm just asking the question.
Can I ask a question that you read the motion again?
Sure. I make a motion to authorize the city manager / city attorney to draft the legal language for a citywide referendum to allow the city to approve a comprehensive agreement for PPA financing on a consolidated school at the current Van Pelt location.
All right, so that's the motion, and there is a second. So is there any further discussion? All right, if the clerk would call the roll, please.
Farnum.
Yes.
Mumpower.
Yes.
Wingard.
Yes.
Hartley.
No.
Osborne.
No.
You can, go ahead, just go a few seconds further. Sorry.
All right, so on to item 3, which is approval of the comprehensive agreement. Staff report.
All right, I think maybe I want to clarify what just happened. Based on that vote, it was 3-2, which means that that motion failed, and there would not be a referendum in the city. So I just want to clarify that for the public and for council.
Correct.
That's correct.
Okay, so you can stop it there.
Approval.
So, from my seat that night, I was under the impression the motion was for a referendum. I think there was plenty of acknowledgement from the dais that everyone assumed it was a 4/5 vote for a referendum. And then that's why I made my comment that it failed on that because we did not receive a 4 out of 5 vote. Now, the minutes state correctly what exactly happened. So based on the minutes and based on the vote, it's my legal opinion that that motion passed, which requires the city manager and the city attorney to draft some language for a referendum. So I just want to bring that to everybody's attention that when that came up, based on the language that was used, based on the responses that council made to one another, I think the assumption was this was for whether or not a referendum would occur in the city about the Van Pelt location for a school. With that being said, the minutes correctly state what happened. The motion carried 3-2, and the minutes go on to say, following the vote of the 3-2, City Manager Randall Eads clarified that a referendum required a 4/5 vote per the city charter. It's clear from the language that was stated that night that that was not a motion to have a referendum, but it was a motion to direct me to draft that language. I think there was probably confusion on everybody's part that night as to what was actually being asked. And I think maybe Mr. Mumpower, based on his responses, may have been a little confused as to what was required as far as the vote goes. Because you did respond in the affirmative at least on 2 occasions about it required a 4/5 vote. So with that being said, what I'm going to do is draft a language, and we'll have this on the next agenda to review that language for the referendum.
Well, can I kind of expound on something? I did acknowledge and agree that it takes a 4/5 vote to pass a referendum, right? So I was agreeing that was required. But my motion was very specific. I had well thought through how my motion was going to be delivered. I thought through that for 2 hours before I came down here. So I specifically said, draft the language. Because to me, I said, there's no way we can even make a vote on a referendum without the language. So when it passed, and then the comments, about the 4-1 vote, I got home, I said, no, wait a minute. Are we really going to draft the language or not? I was getting concerned. And so I
think you texted me that night or
I
next morning.
texted you that night, I said, now, my motion was just to draft the language, which we need to do. And so I was immediately recognizing when I left here that the confusion obviously existed, right, because of what happened. But I wanted to make it clear that that wasn't my motion, and we need to draft the language and go forward and then have the referendum vote, which requires a supermajority.
And I think, I guess the only thing I can say is if that was brought to our attention that night, everybody would have probably paid a little bit closer attention to the
Well,
motion.
it didn't dawn on me
And,
until,
well, it didn't
until I
dawn.
went home and started reconciling what had just happened. And then I said,
And I went back the next day, looked at the video, and, made a little transcript of everything that happened that night. So, but based on the way the motion was presented, the way that it was read a second time, I think the way the mayor talked about that motion the second time, I think the minutes are correct. And as I said, I will go ahead and draft that language for the referendum.
Yeah, and that confusion might have been on the way I phrased it the first time, so.
Well, I do think that was probably part of it, the way you phrased it the first time. I just think there was probably a little bit of confusion. It was a relatively tense meeting, and I think people probably just weren't paying as close attention to the language as we should have been. That includes all 6 of us as we
So you think
stand.
you'll have that by next council
I'll
meeting?
have that
or-
by the next council meeting.
Okay. But there is another correction on that meeting that we need to make, not that particular topic.
Okay.
So you go back to page 1, under mayor's minutes and council comments. Read that first sentence.
Mr. Mumpower thanked everyone that came out to the Christmas parade despite the cold,
But it says mayor's minutes.
and council
Okay,
comments.
so you're saying I was the council, not the mayor's comments? Right. Okay. I'm just making
Well, you
sure
want me to
that was
add
right.
you?
Okay, No.
We can dub you mayor.
okay.
I may have a fight with Mayor Osborne, but. All right.
All
I
right,
just
thank
wanted to
you.
clarify that so everybody knows.
So you're going to go ahead and write it, and we'll have it for the next meeting?
That's correct.
Okay. All right.
I want to clarify too, I think that probably just needs to be a discussion on that language so that, because there are several different ways to write this language in regards to a referendum. So where I'm standing right now, I'm not hearing that anybody wants to vote on it at the next meeting. I'm hearing you want me to present that language and then probably have a discussion about that language before there's a
No,
vote
I think,
taken.
I think you draft the language, and I'm going to ask the question if, because it's an important topic, do you feel like based on the charter, where would it fall? Is it something that would require a public comment in one council meeting, and then we come back and we do the, vote in another to give, public time to absorb the language and give us input before we cast a vote?
I think that's up to council discretion. I think it's one of these things that if council wanted to vote on it immediately after public comment, because this is not necessarily an ordinance, it's not anything that requires, advance notice, more so than what you'd have to give for a typical agenda item. But because eventually what would happen, let's just assume at the next meeting on February 12th, we agree to the language. I would probably come back, we'd advertise that just like you do in a typical agenda item, and have a potential vote, or if council so chose, we would just have a public comment, and then we could push the vote off to the February 26th meeting.
So you do agree then that we could do it all in one night?
I think you could do it on one night if you wanted to.
Okay.
I don't think you have to.
I think if it's done right, we can. I think that's fine. So we do have to put everything on hold until we make that vote, because it could change everything about the project, or am I not thinking right?
Well, I think probably me and you need to have a discussion after this meeting, and I can give you some more details that you're probably not aware of that have occurred over the past few days.
Okay, all right. All right, I'm good.
Cool.
Anything else on the consent?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right. What's the pleasure of council for the consent agenda?
Move we adopt as presented.
Second.
Motion from the vice mayor and second from Mr. Farnum. Please call the roll.
Farnum.
Yes.
Mumpower.
Yes.
Wingard. Hartley.
Yes.
Osborne.
Yes. We stand adjourned.